Well, I would like to start by thanking CPFL, I hope that sounds right, for inviting me, for making this possible. I'd like to thank you all for turning up on an evening after no doubt a hard day's work. I'd like to thank the audience which is, I gather, watching this online, and we'll submit some questions after I finish talking. I would next like to apologize for having to speak in English. I always think when I'm a guest in a country with a different language, it would be nice if I could speak it, but alas, we are not gods, at least I'm not a linguistic god, and I could not talk to you in Portuguese. It's always a bit difficult to know how to start to talk about philosophy. It's a strange word. It's not a word I like very much, although I have spent my professional life as a philosopher. There's an old story about two people gossiping on a bus, and one is saying how awful life is and how she's lost her job and how difficult her children are and so on and so on. And the other one says, oh, well, you just have to be philosophical. Just don't think about it. And that's one side of philosophy, the idea that it enables you to put up with life's difficulties, to be a stoic, to set your mind on higher things. I don't subscribe to that view. I'm not very good when I have toothache, or when things go wrong, or when my children disappoint me. So it's not philosophy in that sense that I ever practice or talk about. I prefer, as I say in one of my books, I prefer the term conceptual engineering. It seems to me that just as engineers study physical structures, structures of aeroplanes or bridges or roads or whatever it might be, so philosophers study the structures of our thought. The structures of our thought mean the categories which we use as we think about ourselves and each other. We talk about reason, we talk about emotion, passion, we talk about proof, knowledge, objectivity, truth, and all those notions can prompt reflection. We start to think about what they mean, whether we know what they mean. One of the most famous questions in the Western canon, in the Bible in fact, is Pontius Pilate's question, what is truth? And that's a question which I've devoted some part of my professional life to, and I might talk about later on. Some questions of that sort are very dry. I was very alarmed when I was shown only 10 minutes ago that the Café Filosófico here has had 3 talks immediately before mine. All 3 of them were about sex. Now, it's very difficult to talk about the structure of concepts and ideas if you're following 3 people who've been talking about sex, because everybody's interested in sex, even when they're my age. In fact, I was once interested enough to write a book about it. It's called, I believe, Luxúria, or something like that in Portuguese. And I believe it was translated. Can anybody tell me if it was translated into Portuguese? Nobody will admit to it. No, well, I admit to having written it, but it was in a series on the 7 deadly sins, which makes it all right. It was an academic book. Okay, so what to talk about? I thought I'd start by talking about what to me is a very interesting subject, namely myself, and I would I would start by saying how I became a philosopher. It's not a story about which I'm proud, but it shows how life has its chances. I went up to Cambridge in 1962 as a young boy, 18 years old, and I had studied maths, physics, and chemistry at school. In the English system, we specialize quite early, and I had studied maths, physics, chemistry, but I wanted to change to a humanistic discipline. I thought that my friends in the humanities were having a much better time than I was. I was being made to stand in a laboratory and repeat experiments on the physical nature of zinc or tin or something. They were sitting in dark cellars with girls discussing Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, and that sounded to me a much better way of spending my time than looking at the electrical properties of tin or something. So I said I wanted to change to the humanities, and in fact I thought I would like to change to English literature. I didn't want to change to history because that sounded like hard work. You had to go and look at archives and libraries. I didn't want to change to languages because I didn't feel I had a great aptitude for languages. So I thought I'd change to read English literature, and that sounded like fun. And the admissions tutor, who was a very fierce man, simply looked at me as if I was some sort of insect. And he said, "You can't read English literature. It is a sloppy subject. You won't like it. You must read moral sciences." And I said, "What's that?" And it turned out that moral sciences was basically Cambridge's term for philosophy. It's an 18th century term. It's a term that 18th century writers use for the study of philosophy. And so I still didn't know what that was. So they sent me a reading list, and I found out for the first time about Plato and Aristotle and Hume and Descartes and Kant and the great philosophers. And I loved it. It was right up my street. Because you could be as rude as you liked about any philosophy. That was part of the culture, as it were. You said, "This argument doesn't work, it's no good." And then your tutor said, "Well, maybe there's some good in it. Maybe you have to refine your thoughts a little." And so you were allowed to be a very obstreperous, skeptical, difficult adolescent, which I think I probably was. And that was encouraged. That was good. It wasn't that the teachers said, "Shut up," or "Be quiet," or "Just learn the book." You were actually encouraged to be questioning and to ask difficult questions and say, "I don't follow this. Why is that true?" And that suited me down to the ground because I was that kind of person, I suppose. I'd like to put in a word at this point about the value of that kind of education. And with apologies to Lewis, who brought me here and who heard this story last night, I'll tell the story because I think it illustrates something very important about education and about philosophy. And this is a true story from my daughter's education. My daughter was at a very good school in Oxford. I was teaching in Oxford for many years as my children were growing up. And she came home one day, she was about 15 years old, and said, "I hate science. I'm not doing any more science." And I said, "I'm sorry to hear that, because although I left science, I still had a great respect for it, and I still read scientific articles occasionally." I said, "I'm sorry to hear that. What's the problem?" And she said, "I don't understand it." And I said, "What don't you understand?" And it turned out that they had been asked in class to solve a problem to do with the pendulum. If there are any engineers in this room from CPFL, they will understand the problem. They were asked to solve for the velocity of a pendulum. At the bottom of its swing, the pendulum is moving with a certain speed. What's the velocity of the pendulum? And they were given that the potential energy of the pendulum, as it's stationary at the top of the swing, is equal to the kinetic energy of the pendulum at the bottom of the swing, and that does enable you to solve for the velocity of the pendulum, given its length, and the gravitational force, and so on. So I said, "Well, what's the problem?" And my daughter said, "I don't understand what this thing energy is. There is no energy. There's nothing at the top of the swing. The pendulum is sitting still. It doesn't have any energy. So what's this potential energy? And what's the kinetic energy at the bottom of the swing? I don't understand this word energy." So I said, "Did you ask the teacher?" And she said, "Yes." I said, what did the teacher say? The teacher said, get on and solve the equation. Now, this is wrong in so many ways. It's wrong in so many ways. My daughter's question is a very good one. In fact, the concept of energy in use in that equation, it wasn't available to the pioneers of the pendulum. The first scientific study of the pendulum probably started with Galileo. It may have started slightly before Galileo, but roughly it started with Galileo, who was the first to notice that the period of a pendulum, the amount of time of its swing, is both independent of its mass and independent of the angle, at least within limits, to which you swing it. It's the isochronous properties of the pendulum. The pendulum was then studied by, amongst others, Huygens, Leibniz, Newton, Euler, and in the 19th century it became a topic again of interest. And it was only in about 1870 that the concept of energy, that my daughter had been asked to understand, became a common property of physics. The laws of conservation of energy were actually late 19th century discoveries or late 19th century concepts. And they only arose after both electromagnetic energy had become a topic of study and also thermodynamics, the equations between heat and energy. In other words, my daughter has been presented with a concept which it took 250 years of European science, the brightest minds, to develop. She was told nothing of this. She was just told she ought to get on with it. Just use it. Don't worry your head about what it means. Now, I think missing out that history and missing out the story of why people like Newton and Leibniz argued about the nature of energy. They argued about vis viva, vis inertia. Was there such a thing as an inertial force? Was there such a thing as... they confused together momentum and energy and all sorts of things. So there's a huge history of the brightest minds in Europe failing to understand the modern concept or the classical concept, because of course it all changed about 30 years afterwards as soon as the interchangeability of energy and mass arrived with relativistic physics. It seems to me shocking that an education should, as it were, blinker, should stop a student from asking the sort of question that my daughter asked. And one advantage of philosophy and of the history of ideas, the philosophy of ideas and the history of ideas, is that it opens the student's mind to the difficulties involved in even the most elementary sounding concept, a concept that you might think is the property of the whole world, that has no history, has always been part of the thought processes of mankind. And if you learn that concepts are not, they have a life, they have a history, they have a pattern of discovery, a pattern of refinement, a pattern of change, then you learn something very important about our minds and eventually about our lives and our politics. Because I think one of the most dangerous political ideas is the idea that our way is the only way. We are the only people of reason, or we are the only people who have got something right. Our way is the best way. I think opening your mind to other ways of thought, which is one of the things that philosophy and history most certainly do for you, is a very important educational device. And without it, think of what we risk. Supposing my daughter, like some of her contemporaries, had no doubt said, okay, I can solve this equation. I'll just go on and solve it. The teacher will give me a tick. I will pass the examination. I will get to university. I go and become a lawyer or a doctor or an engineer, something useful. That would have been a success in many people's views. On the other hand, it's a success that is bought at a cost. And the cost is that of simply believing what you're told, of not thinking about what you're told. And I think that's a cost, because I think when people fail to reflect on what they're told, or fail to reflect on their own ideas, they become blind to the the possibility of alternatives and to the social and political structures that enabled us to get to understand the things we do. I mean, another aspect of the history of the pendulum would be to ask why it became interesting in the mid-17th century. And one answer to that is that at that time trade routes were opening up across the Atlantic, trade routes even as far as the Pacific. People needed to be able to keep time at sea. The only kind of timekeeper they had, apart from the sun, but they needed an independent timekeeper to work out the longitude, how far east or west of the Greenwich meridian, the line that defines 0 degrees in longitude. So they needed an accurate timekeeper at sea, and the best bet seemed to be some device associated with the pendulum. And in fact, that went on being true until the invention of the chronometer in the late 18th century. So the pendulum was a matter of intense interest because of a surrounding economic and historical and cultural development. And that too is a very interesting story about the embedding of science in a particular generation's needs and a particular generation's ways of coping with the world. Socrates is supposed to have said that the unexamined life is not worth living. Hegel said that philosophy is the queen of the sciences. We philosophers always like to hear that. We like to hear that we're the queen of the sciences. But of course, that can sound like special pleading. It sounds like Socrates sounds like a dentist saying that the only life worth having is a life spent pulling teeth. Well, that's not true. Why did Hegel think that philosophy was the queen of the sciences? Nowadays, I think if you took a snap poll on the internet, what's the queen of the sciences? People would say physics. Physics, perhaps mathematics, mathematical physics. Why did Hegel think that philosophy was? Well, he may have had bad reasons, but I think he had good reasons. And the good reason was that all paths lead to reflection. A physicist may do wonderful work based on a particular set of concepts with a particular set of problems. But eventually he's going to use terms like energy, time, entropy in his thoughts about physical systems. And if he starts to reflect, he's going to ask of the nature of those concepts, what's their identity, what do they really mean, how do we measure them, is their meaning just given by the way that we measure them, or is something else involved? And those are philosophical questions. They're questions in which the concepts which he normally uses themselves become the topic of interest. And I think that's characteristic of philosophy. One metaphor to explain that might be this, that when you look at the world, you look at the world deploying a set of categories, using a set of thoughts. One of the few things that all psychologists and philosophers agree about now is that there is no such thing as the innocent eye. Your eye is trained. Your eye is the eye of somebody who has your human experience, has learnt to detect various saliences in the scene around you, to notice some things, to fail to notice other things, to categorize the world in a certain way. Fly, kill. That's like, Obama did that, didn't he? He killed a fly. His predecessors, President Roosevelt, used to kill bears. Where was I? There's no such thing as the innocent eye. Therefore, your perception of the world is conditioned by the categories that you bring to it, the categories of thought, the categories that determine how you see the world around you. Philosophy arises when those categories are themselves the subject of your vision. You turn your attention onto the lens through which you normally see the world. The lens formed by your preconceived ideas, your culturally embedded traditions and habits, the things that you naturally interpret the world in terms of. then become the topics of thought. I think that we are naturally reflective beings. We naturally reflect. Some of us reflect more than others. It's perhaps the curse of my life to have had to reflect a great deal, because that's what a philosopher does. But I think nobody is so innocent as to think that their way of perceiving the world is the only possible way of perceiving the world. And then you have to ask yourself, what is the justification of the categories you bring to the world? Are there alternatives? Could they do better? Could they be refined? Could they be more clear? Could you be helped to understand them better, to understand the roots of inference, the practices in which they become embedded and to which they give rise? So let me give an example, because all this is very abstract, and one of the problems of philosophy is it can sound a very abstract discipline. So I like homely examples. Let's take the example of you doing something. Let's tell a story. Okay, suppose you are, let's say you're a woman, Anna, and you have a friend, Beth, and you, Anna, and Beth are together baking a cake. It's a nice homely activity. Beth thinks you're a very good cook. She's come to ask you to help her. You're a helpful person. You, Anna, are helping Beth to bake a cake. You are baking a cake together. Right? Now suppose it turns out that the reason, really, Beth wants to bake a cake with you is she wants to take the cake and use it to seduce your boyfriend. She is going to present this cake. You have a dishy boyfriend. Let's call him Alfonso. And Beth is going to take this cake and give it to Alfonso later on in the evening when you're not around, and try to seduce him by appealing to his appetite for cakes. And eventually she hopes his appetite for Beth. Okay, what happens when you learn that? You're insulted. You feel destroyed. You feel resentful. I imagine you do. Can't you imagine this? You feel that you've been betrayed. Your friend has betrayed you. She pretended to be doing something with you. Really, she was doing something against you. It's very bad. You can't help feeling indignant. You can't help feeling, as I say, a sense of betrayal, a sense of resentment. You've been let down. Your trust has been destroyed. Your world, in this respect, has come to an end. Beth is no longer your friend. Or was it Anna? I can't remember. All those are attitudes to do with resentment, injustice, being let down, being betrayed. They're very specific feelings. You can't really have them towards a thing. You can be very annoyed at your computer when it doesn't fire up. But it's not the same. It's not betraying you. It's not letting you down. You can sort of feel that a computer is betraying you. And in that case, you might momentarily get angry and throw it on the floor or something. But it's not a very good reaction, and you probably feel slightly foolish 5 minutes later when you have to go out and buy a new computer. On the other hand, you feel justified in your reaction to this story, this betrayal. Now, some philosophers think that this is irrational, or they've argued that this is irrational. They've said that, look, we are just complicated creatures of flesh and blood, complicated physiological systems. There is no self as opposed to the embodied person, the embodied animal, what Aristotle would have called the animated animal. The animated animal is just a complicated version of a computer. It works according to physical laws. It works according to a design set by evolution. And it's a fantasy to suppose that you can do anything else than follow out the script written in your programming, in your brain or your blood or your genetics. Hence the set of ideas associated with freedom are illusory. The world is a deterministic world, or if it's not, at best there are quantum indeterminacies, but that just introduces an element of randomness. It doesn't introduce an element of responsibility. I thought there was a snake for a moment. So how do you balance those two thoughts? On the one hand, you are, as a natural human being, you're resentful of Beth, you hold her responsible, you think she behaved badly, you'd like to see her somehow suffer for this deception, perhaps. You certainly feel resentful. You feel it would, the English phrase is, serve Beth right if she, as it were, if Alfonso, your boyfriend, murdered her or something. Those are human reactions. On the other hand, the intellectual story seems to tell you that those human reactions are inappropriate, just as inappropriate as blaming the weather, or just as inappropriate as feeling resentful about the lack of rain, or about the presence of rain if you have a holiday which is spoilt by rain. So how do you balance those two thoughts? That on the one hand, our interpersonal reactions are ones of to do with blame, to do with responsibility, to do with resentment, to do with gratitude, to do with injustice, justice, and so on. Whereas our intellectual categories may make that very difficult to sustain. We find it very hard to protect those categories, to defend them, when we think about each other in the sort of more objective light as just large physical systems with large physical things happening to us. This is a very urgent question. It's a question, for example, in the philosophy of law. Do we look on people as people to be, in a wonderful phrase by the British philosopher Peter Strawson, are people to be managed or handled or cured or trained? That's the objective attitude. Or are they people to whom we should feel resentment, gratitude, the various human emotions, the reactive emotions that I've been talking about? Well, Strawson wanted to defend the reactive attitudes, and he wanted to say that the metaphysics of determinism and the metaphysics of causation do not affect them. They don't make it irrational to hold them. And it's a difficult area. It's an area where there's a lot of philosophy and a lot of philosophers have disagreed. But it seems to me intensely interesting, both for its own intellectual sake, but also, as I say, because it has practical refraction. There's a refraction into practice. As neurophysiologists learn more about the workings of the brain, there's more and more sense that the reactive attitudes will give way to the objective, medical attitudes. So, for example, eventually, perhaps, I come, if I'm Beth in my story and I'm trying to steal Anna's boyfriend by pretending to maybe be making a cake with her, I just get up and say to Anna, well, look, I'm sorry, that's just the way I am. That's the way my genes reacting in their environment, that's what they've made me. Don't blame me. Blame God, blame the universe. And will Anna listen? Well, maybe neurophysiology will bring in a change of culture within which Anna will listen. And we stop regarding each other in the light of responsible agents. And then the philosopher might ask, would that be an improvement? Would that actually be a new kind of human life in which sometimes punitive and retributive attitudes have no place? Or would there be a loss? Could you no longer smile at each other? Could you no longer enjoy the pleasure of doing things together? Because all the time you'd be feeling that the other person is simply an instrument, simply a machine, simply something which you're using for your own gratification at a particular point in time and for a particular purpose. So in these ways, quite intellectual questions about determinism, questions about the metaphysics of causation, which might seem very abstract to the private preserve of people like me who enjoy those things, will actually spill out into practice. All ideas affect practice. Eventually, as I say in one of my books, it is ideas for which people kill each other. It's ideas which make people go to war. It's ideas which determine the benefits, the costs and benefits of cooperation, the ways in which we feel social justice is or is not implemented in particular political and moral schemes of living. So ideas are the most important determinants of our lives in many ways. Of course, other things are too. Energy is very important. I have to say this in this building. Energy is very important. But ideas will determine who can pay for the energy, who can deploy the world's resources, how they are to be allocated. Those will be ideas to do with for example, the different roles of the market and the different roles of the body politic, of the social and political structures that we live in. In the 1980s, we saw a very strange sea change in the climate of ideas. 1980s, 1979, it happened in Britain. Suddenly, the post-war consensus of the view, that was the view that we're all in it together. It was the view that created in Europe the welfare state. The idea that the collective, the body politic, the nation or the group, we all hung together. People deserved, therefore, if they couldn't afford it, they deserved free education. If they couldn't afford it, they deserved free medicine. They deserved that the state look after us, take care of our vulnerable side, our dependencies, basically from birth to death. And that was a consensus in Europe, certainly, before the Second World War, but it gained in speed after the Second World War. Until suddenly, in about 1979, the arrival of Mrs. Thatcher as Prime Minister of Great Britain, that's the bit of history I know about, suddenly people started saying things like, greed is good. Right? I don't know if it happened here, but it happened in America about the same time, the arrival of the Republicans, Ronald Reagan. Private contract became sacrosanct. The wisdom of the market, the idea that you could have simply individual atoms, selfish atoms, self-interested, atomistic, individual people, owing no identity to society, no identity to their culture, their surrounding, their politics, free individual agents. And the ideal political and social arrangement was one in which these free agents simply tried to maximize their own profits or their own pleasure or their own economic well-being by means of interchange, free market interchange with each other. This became the ideology of the market, the ideology of the free market. It's a huge change, a real change from seeing people as elements of a social cooperative, a social whole, to seeing people in terms of individual atoms. Of course, the idea was not itself entirely new. The idea that people are individually selfish, single, solitary agents was there, for example, in Thomas Hobbes in the middle of the 17th century. But that was at a time of civil war in Britain. And you could see how people were, as it were, involved in a war of all against all, which was Hobbes's famous phrase. Why did this happen in 1979? I don't know the answer. I guess the terms of cooperation which make up a society or a collective have begun to seem wrong to the people who felt that the amount they were contributing to the social good was more than the amount they were getting out of it. So they naturally felt they could form a breakaway. We, the rich, can, as it were, afford to ignore the poor. The poor are being parasitic upon the rich. And that became the set of ideas. It's most famously exhibited in Robert Nozick's book, Anarchy, State and Utopia, a right-wing riposte to the more social justice-orientated book of John Rawls, A Theory of Justice, and those two books together basically have set the scene for political philosophy ever since. A curious aspect of this kind of shift in perspective, which I think has to be understood historically, is that at the same time books arriving from quite different disciplines started to sort of sing to the same hymn sheet, as we say, that is, to sing the same tune. So, for example, Richard Dawkins wrote the book The Selfish Gene in, I think, 1976, just about the same time that I'm talking about. Now, it's actually a very silly title for what is, in some respects, a very silly book, because genes aren't selfish. Genes have no motivational states. Genes don't have a sense of themselves. Genes don't have anything. They just come and go. The ones that come are ones that find a niche in an animal, say ourselves. The animal finds its niche in a social society, in a group of other animals. We are not solitary animals, we're social animals. As a result, no doubt, some genes go forward. They're more common in the next generation, just as some phenotypical traits, maximum traits that you can observe in each other, go forward and become more common in the next generation. There's nothing in Darwinian theory that talks about selfishness in that respect. It simply talks about reproductive advantage. And that's simply a statistical concept of what gets through to the next generation. There's absolutely no theorem of human society that the people who reproduce the most are the people who are the most selfish. That's absolutely absurd. And on the contrary, often in many social setups, the people who are the most selfish are the quickest to get their throats cut. Selfishness is not necessarily an adaptive trait. And that's because, as human beings, we create social niches for each other. We monitor each other's behavior. If you're selfish, like, say, the people in my story, the girl who's exploiting the other one in order to steal her boyfriend, if you're like that, you're not likely to do very well in most societies. In a well-functioning society where transactions are repeated and you've got a kind of monitoring device to see who is cooperative and who is not, the people who don't hang together may hang separately. They will go do worse than the others. So there's absolutely there was nothing in Darwinian theory to justify the Dawkinsian take, the Dawkins take on that theory. And the fact that it suddenly resonated with people was, again, a peculiar aspect of that particular historical social juncture. And I think studying the evolution of ideas in relation to the matrix, the social, economic, political matrix within which they grow, is one of the things people like me enjoy doing. We try to do, and sometimes we do it badly, and sometimes we try and do it well. And, well, we always try to do it well. Sometimes perhaps we manage to do it well. Well, there are many other aspects of philosophy I could talk about. It's now 10 to 8. Could one of the people who knows what my timing should be tell me how many more minutes I should talk, or perhaps I should stop talking and solicit questions? Would you like me to go on, or yes, you want me to go on? I couldn't quite see. Hang on, I need my spectacles. Was that a signal saying, "For God's sake, shut up," or "Please go on"? Sorry. Go on for a little bit. Okay. I'll go on talking about myself. I became infamous, notorious in the profession for the motto was not mine, but it was a motto I tried to follow faithfully. A great Cambridge philosopher, Frank Ramsey, the man who's lent his name to theorems in economics, theorems in mathematics, and theorems or views in logic and philosophy, and he died at the age of 27. In fact, he died just before his 27th birthday. A very brilliant man, Frank Ramsey. And he said that in philosophy it was very good advice when you see two positions at loggerheads to ask what is right about each of them and to see if you can find a compromise. I started in philosophy of science, as my love of science, I hope, shows. I went on, this is my biography, to be interested in the philosophy of language, and I became very interested in the notion of representation. Most people thinking of language think that language is there to represent the facts. So on the one hand, you've got the world, which is a world of facts. And on the other hand, you've got language, which is supposed to be a device, an instrument for us reporting the facts to one another, describing the facts. Now, the early Wittgenstein, the Wittgenstein of the Tractatus, which was the great Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein's book, written in 1916 to 1921, his first book, really presented language as a way of picturing the world. So language represented the world in the way that a portrait represents a sitter. The picture theory of meaning. Famously, there's a famous story that Wittgenstein was explaining his ideas to an economist, a Cambridge Marxist economist called Piero Sraffa, an Italian. And Piero Sraffa, who was a Neapolitan from Naples, there's a gesture which I believe goes something like this, right? And so Piero Sraffa said to Wittgenstein, okay, what does this represent? And of course Wittgenstein realized that this is not the only use of language. Language is not just there to describe or represent things, it's also there to voice reactions to things or to express reactions to things. So saying, you know, knock it, don't do that, might be a kind of linguistic equivalent of frowning, of expressing dislike or rejection of something that somebody is doing. Saying, I'm in pain, might be a linguistic equivalent of going, you know, expressing pain by means of a gesture or a noise, a shriek. So Wittgenstein got very interested in the expressive uses of language which are not there to describe anything, but to express things. And this actually picks up on an old idea in philosophy, an idea which was very prominent in the 18th century amongst the Scottish school of philosophy, David Hume and Adam Smith, and following them Immanuel Kant, who saw lots of uses of language which might appear to describe aspects of reality simply in terms of the expression of, say, emotion or attitude or other reactions to reality. And the big battleground for this kind of idea was ethics. If I say that something is good or bad, it's your duty, it's an obligation, or I've got a right to something, am I trying to describe an aspect of the world, an aspect of reality? Am I representing something about our situation? Or am I simply voicing a reaction to our situation, expressing an emotion about it? So if I say, I've got a right to possess this piece of land, is that describing something, or is it simply saying, I've got my elbows out, I'm going to go for possessing this piece of land. That's my direction. Am I expressing a direction of practical approach, or something more like an emotion or an attitude, or am I describing an aspect of reality? So those are the two opposing positions. The realists thought that we're describing an aspect of reality. Their saint is Plato. Plato thought that it was very, very difficult to know the form of the good, the ideal. It was a topic of knowledge, and it was a knowledge that was available only to the elect. Christianity came along and made Plato's idea democratic. Anybody could, even a little child could know the form of the good, provided they were pure in heart and obeyed the Catholic Church or whatever it might be. This idea that there's something there to be known is very deep in Western culture. But then in the Scottish 18th century, there arose the other idea that reason doesn't tell you about the good. Reason, in this respect, is the slave of the passions, Hume's famous phrase, and has no other office but to serve and obey them. Complete reversal of the Platonic picture. Huge reversal, a huge revolution in the 18th century. For Plato, reason rules the passions. The charioteer The charioteer is the embodiment of reason, and he steers the horses of the passions in the right way. And the one thing he mustn't do is let go of the reins, or passions will lead you anywhere. Hume comes along and says, no, reason is the slave of the passions. It has no other office than to serve and obey them. Reason tells you about the environment in which you're to act. Your passions tell you how to act, because they give you your desires, your goals, your aims, your attitudes, your emotions, everything that makes you practical, makes you a behaving, acting animal. Again, a huge revolution, a much bigger revolution than the revolution I mentioned from 1979. How to solve this? Who is right, Plato or Hume? Well, Ramsay's maxim says, look for the best in both sides. So I set myself to do something about that. My sympathies were with Hume, as you might expect. I'm not a Scotsman, but I was brought up quite near to Edinburgh, so just in England. So my sympathies with Hume. And I always found Plato slightly difficult to take. He's an elitist. He's a rationalist. He's got rather mysterious ideas. He didn't like artists. He famously wanted to banish the artists from his republic. He had all sorts of ideas to which I found myself not very attracted. Whereas Hume is a wonderfully attractive writer. If you've never read David Hume, if there's a single book of philosophy, if you've never read a book of philosophy, there's one book you want to read, the book should be Hume's Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. It is the only funny philosophy book in the language. I like to think my own is the only funny philosophy dictionary in the language. I wrote the Oxford Dictionary of Philosophy, and I tried to put some jokes in it. But Hume's is the only genuinely funny philosophy book when I say in the language, I mean in the Western tradition. Doesn't matter which language. So who's right, Hume or Plato? Well, as I say, I found myself drawn to Hume, but lots of philosophers thought they had decisive objections to Hume. They said that Hume makes morality a matter of mere preference, mere desire, mere attitude. It makes moral disagreements simply a matter of a clash of wills. It makes moral arguments simply a matter of persuasion. It somehow deflates the whole subject. And it means that if you talk, for example, of human rights, then you're really just expressing preference. You're really just expressing mere preference, mere desire. You're not, as it were, seizing hold of something which could hold an argumentative weight. And I wanted to say, can't we be Hume and still hold on to something of that weight? So what I tried to do was to find a way of finding common ground or compromise between the Humean position and the Platonic position. And believe me, it's very difficult. It leads to quite technical problems, for example, in the theory of truth, theory of representation. What is it for the mind to represent something in any case? And so here we have what seems to me a very intelligible antagonism between two schools of thought, but to adjust your mind to find the best in both sides can lead into professional philosophy, into the kind of thing that fills the journals and that gives people like me a bad name, but also gives us a lot to do because we start writing things which it's very hard to understand, and sometimes things which it's hard for our colleagues to understand, which is why they misunderstand me all the time. Anyhow, that's an item of autobiography about the kind of problem which has occupied quite a lot of my intellectual life. And I think that looking back on it, the thing that really interests me is the interplay between these very intellectual topics. They may seem very remote from anything of immediate practical interest. We're interested in economy, we're interested in the distribution of costs and benefits of cooperation, we're interested in perhaps our morality, how to deal with our daughter who's going off the rails or something like that. Those are the practical affairs of life, and it's this interplay between our ideas, our concepts, the lenses through which we see the world, and practice. which has always struck me as the absolutely fascinating justification, really, for being interested in philosophy. So that's a kind of apologia pro vita sua, as Cardinal Newman wrote his autobiography, an apology for his life. And that's my apology for my life. Thank you very much.
Obrigado, professor BlackBurn, por ter trazido a importância da filosofia no mundo de hoje. Então, passamos para o debate com a plateia. Levantem a mão. Quem estiver a fim de fazer uma pergunta, por favor, levante a mão, aguardem alguns segundos que a câmera chegue até vocês, afinal, nós estamos gravando, e logo em seguida tentem fazer uma pergunta objetiva de maneira tal que a maioria das pessoas possam ser atendidas. Obrigado.
Hi there. So,
Hello?
Can I ask you a question in English, if that's all right?
Oh, please do.
Right. Thank you for your talk. So you mentioned the role of philosophy as helping us understand concepts, the way they're built, the way they're structured, the categories involved in them. I think we have very serious conceptual problems in the 21st century which require a lot of hard work, such as the limitation of our planet, the environment, and the restrictions that imposes.
Yes.
And I think that raises very serious philosophical questions as to selfishness, social and collective responsibility, and so on and so forth.
Yes.
So I trained personally as a pure mathematician.
Oh, yes.
Actually, partly in the place where you work.
Mm. Oh,
And nowadays I find myself doing some research on quantitative issues associated to the environment.
Yes.
So I think I'm in a moral high ground position to ask you, what do you think philosophers can contribute to this debate in the 21st century? What contributions of philosophical research can we expect from your lot?
Good. Yes. A very good question. Have the translators made it plain to people? I'm still hearing... okay. Right. It's a wonderful question. Thank you. I think what's... starting with Thomas Hobbes, and then with Rousseau, and then going into the 20th century, philosophers have been very interested in the emergence of cooperative solutions to problems. The most famous problem became actually crystallized in the 20th century mathematically as the prisoner's dilemma. Do you know that, or shall I explain the prisoner's dilemma to people? The prisoner's dilemma is that any structure... I won't say why it's called the prisoner's dilemma, that would take too long. It's any structure where individuals rationally pursuing their individual self-interest nevertheless arrive at an equilibrium which is socially bad. It's socially worse than a different equilibrium. So here's an example. Suppose there is a water shortage, right? And the water companies, the utilities say, please restrict your usage of water. That way the water may last longer until the next rains come, or we hold out longer. Each individual can say something like this. Look, either the others are going to save water, or they're not. If the others save water, it doesn't matter whether I use water. My usage has infinitesimal effect on the reservoirs, on the water supply, or anything. So if the others are going to restrict themselves, I do better by using as much water as I want. On the other hand, suppose the others are not going to restrict themselves. Suppose the others are going to ignore the plea to save water. They're going to use lots of water. well, in that case, I'd better use water too, because otherwise I am a victim. I am the only one who is behaving well in a world in which the water is going to run out very quickly anyhow. So I won't have my drink of water, I won't have my shower, I won't water my lawn, everybody else will be watering their lawn, and so I'm a victim. Or again, take the exploitation of resources, which I think was your interest. Fisheries. Suppose there's a problem with fishing stocks. Fishing stocks are declining. I'm a fisherman. We're told, suppose there's no law, there's no sovereign, as Hobbes called it. We're all asked to restrict our catch. So what do? Well, the others may restrict their catch. If the others catch fewer fish, then it doesn't matter whether I go on and catch lots of fish. I'll make more profit, I'll do better, because the price of fish will have risen. My self-interest will be served by being the only fisherman who brings in big catch of fish when the others are restraining themselves to bring in small catch of fish. So self-interest points me to taking as many fish as possible. Suppose, on the other hand, the others are going to take as many fish as possible as they can. They're not going to listen to the demand, to the request for self-restraint either. Well then, if the others are going to take a lot of fish, I better take a lot of fish, because I better make as much money as I can while there are any fish left. If I restrain myself, I make less money now than the others. The price of fish is depressed because there are lots of fish being landed, and eventually the fish run out anyhow, and I have just become a victim again of my own integrity, of my own ability to cooperate. That's the so-called logic, it's sometimes called the logic of the tragedy of the commons, or the tragedy that each individual, following their own self-interest, can generate a social equilibrium which is much worse than if every individual restricted their self-interest in the interests of the communal good. Adam Smith is famously supposed to have said, in fact he did say, that with the market you get an invisible hand. The invisible hand is the idea that each individual pursuing their self-interest generates the biggest possible social pie. That's the logic of the market. That is, everything's better for everyone because we all behave efficiently, we maximize the allocation of resources, we make mutually advantageous trades, so the social world gets better, the social pie gets bigger. The tragedy of the commons, or the logic of the prisoner's dilemma, is the opposite. It's the invisible boot. That is, everybody pursuing their individual self-interest gives rise to the worst possible social equilibrium. And yet nobody can afford to defect. Nobody can afford to be the martyr, the sole person who stands out against the logic of self-interest. There are other varieties. There are other mathematical models which approximate to that. One of them is the so-called assurance game, where it's individually better to belong to a cooperative society. In the prisoner's dilemma or the commons, it's individually better to forget about the others and just pursue your own self-interest. But in the assurance game, which was visible to Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 18th century, it may be individually better to belong to a socially cooperative group, but you can't be sure that the others see it that way. And that uncertainty makes it individually rational again to defect, to pursue your own self-interest. Rousseau's very nice example of this was called a stag hunt. In a stag hunt, as Rousseau imagined it, you have a stag in a forest. Now, it takes a lot of people cooperating to catch a stag. You have to stop every exit from the forest. You have to have somebody there ready to catch the stag or shoot it if it tries to escape. It's best for me to have a piece of stag. That's great. If I'm a member of a hunting cooperative and we catch a stag, I have a really good meal. On the other hand, there are hares about, little rabbits or hares. Eating stag is best, but having a hare is better than having nothing. There's a bit of meat on a hare. Not much meat, but a bit of meat. Now, what are the others going to do? Will any of them be tempted to catch a hare, to leave their post, in which case the stag will escape, and I will get nothing if I stand to catch stags and wait, but the others have gone off and caught hares. They'll do something worse. That's called an assurance game, and under obvious circumstances, you'll find that people don't cooperate. They go off and catch a hare because they're not sure that the others are going to coordinate, going to cooperate. I think energy policy in the 21st century is going to be very, very difficult to establish. The Kyoto Agreement and its failures have already shown that we are basically in the kind of logic of the logic of the situation is exactly that Rousseau and the Prisoner's Dilemma, and the tragedy of the commons or the tragedy of the fishing exemplify. It may be best for the world if we restrict very heavily our use of hydrocarbon energy. Perhaps I shouldn't say that at CPFL, but I'll say it anyhow. Perhaps it's best for the world if we all do that. No single country will feel motivated to do it unless it can be sure that everybody else is going to do it. Suppose at present solar energy is more expensive than energy derived from depleting hydrocarbon resources, which I think is true. Solar energy is expensive to harness through solar panels and silicon technology. Can, say, Britain or can Brazil decide, I don't care what the other countries are doing, we are going to invest solely or entirely or mainly in solar technology? No, because if that energy is more expensive, the country is going to grow poorer so long as other people are still using hydrocarbon energy, which is cheaper. Their goods will be cheaper, their economies will do better, they will outperform you, and you will have relative poverty. You'd need to be sure that the rest of the world was going to coordinate. Now, how can you be sure of that? Well, something that philosophers have known about for a long time, this is there in Machiavelli, I think he was the first thinker to really notice this, is that princes, what he called princes, but this means governments, behave worse than private individuals. Governments always behave worse than private individuals. That's a theorem. I once said that to an audience of business people, which included Prince Charles. So I was very delighted to say princes always behave worse than other people. But it really means governments. And the reason is it's easy to see. If we, in an individual social circumstance, make a contract, it will be very bad for me if I'm the one person to break it, because I won't be trusted again, and we may have to react with each other again and again. And if my contract is to do something where it's immediately clear whether I perform or not, and it's immediately clear to the others what the benefit of performance is, then if I don't perform, I will be the victim of social dislike and social punishment, perhaps. I might go to prison. With governments, it's not like that. A government can sign up to the Kyoto Agreement and walk away and actually not fulfill its obligations under that agreement at all. The individual president or politician, the prime minister, needn't suffer. He suffers only if the electorate, the people who elect him, feel betrayed, feel that he's let them down. But they are far more likely to feel that he's let them down if we are the only country which is abiding by this agreement, and the others, by failing to abide by it, are outperforming us economically or in whatever way it emerges. So the difficulty of finding a cooperative solution to these dilemmas, and this can be modeled mathematically, and of course mathematical game theory is just a numerical modeling of this kind of problem. The difficulty of finding a cooperative solution to these coordination problems, as they're called, is very great, and it's much greater in the political and international dimension than it is in the private dimension. As private individuals, we learn to cooperate, and we learn that the costs of reneging on an agreement, the costs, as it were, of doing what you said you wouldn't do, are very great. In the international and public arena, that's not nearly so true, because the government answers to an electorate, and the electorate, it will notice if it's getting poorer than the Chinese or the Indians or the Japanese or whoever it might be, or it will fear that it's going to get poorer than them if we behave in a principled way, even if the principled solution is the best cooperative solution for the world. So finding the cooperative equilibrium is notoriously difficult. And this has been known to philosophers for centuries. This logic has been known to philosophers for centuries. So there is a, as it were, a literature out there, a literature of wisdom about these areas. Do we have a solution? Well, the original solution to these problems was due to Thomas Hobbes, who said to find cooperative solutions, we must hand over power to a sovereign. And in the international arena, that would mean a world government. But that's not going to happen. That is nationally impossible. Great Britain hates Europe. Even handing over very limited power to Europe is very difficult for British politicians, because the electorate says, we don't want to be governed from Brussels. We don't want to be governed from somewhere else. Can you imagine the United States handing over to a world government? The United States won't even hand over judicial powers to the International War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague. No United States citizen will ever be tried at that tribunal. Nobody is going to be happy. There's no political reality behind the idea of a world government. So Hobbes' solution of finding a sovereign is not going to work. There's no international policeman. So what you're going to find is, I think, a progressive deterioration of the equilibria which people manage to find as they approach problems of not just global warming, which might issue, for example, in pressure on land, pressure on the parts of the world which remain habitable, diminishing hydrocarbon resources, the possibility of monopoly possession of the precious metals and the rare metals that are necessary for technology. All those things will pose huge problems of international cooperation. And personally, I'm quite pessimistic about the possibility of solutions. There is, of course, always a final solution, which is war. That always solves things. At least it solves things for the people who are dead. But that is a problem facing the world, and I think philosophers have known about the problem. Finding cooperative solutions without force is very, very difficult. And I don't think we know how to do it. I don't think anybody knows how to do it. So thank you for the questions. Great question.
Good evening.
Hello.
First of all, I'd like to apologize because I had a very, very short study on philosophies. So excuse me if I'm not clear enough for you, and if I have to rephrase it, I'll do that. Please tell me. About Nietzsche and his nihilism.
Nietzsche and his?
Nihilism, the
nihilism,
nothing.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Do you think that we could relate the nihilism of Nietzsche with what I understand from nihilism, that we are all being driven to a nothing, a whole nothing, because we are not human beings anymore. We mean what we use, the landmarks, the brands we use. We are not human beings anymore. We are what we buy. So I think that this, correct me if I'm wrong, if you think I'm wrong, that this is the nihilism, this is the nothing we are being driven to. So do you think that we could relate this nothing to, or better, to fight this, to go against it with the Christian idea of a God that example to us to give himself to the others? So if we give ourselves to the others, could we solve this problem or this future problem of the nothing, the whole nothing we are going through?
Good. Yes. Did everybody got a translation of the question or heard the question? Do you want me to repeat it, or you all got the question? Yeah, good. Nietzsche is often described as a nihilist. I'm not sure. Well, of course, he wrote books over a period of 20 years or so before he finally declined into madness. Nietzsche had, I think, quite a. I think it's only half true to say that he was a nihilist. I think Nietzsche, he talks a lot, of course, about the Superman, about the man who's to come, the Zarathustra, the ideal. He certainly hated the civilization of his time in Germany. He didn't just make bad remarks about women and Jews. He made bad remarks about Germans. He didn't like the modern world. That's true. But I think at least part of him didn't like it because he had an ideal. He wasn't a nihilist. He just had an ideal of some kind of power, some kind of capacity which human beings could exercise, which he thought the modern world did not afford us the ability or the opportunity to exercise. Now, a very good example which your question raised is consumer culture. Consumer culture. We are what we possess. We are what we buy. Your status in a society is measured by the make of your car, the brand name on your handbag, whatever it might be. And yet people, when they get the new car, it makes them happy for Christmas Day, but then after that it's just another thing. They get the new handbag, it makes them happy when they go and show off to their friends, but then it loses its charm and it becomes like a child's doll tossed aside in the bottom of the wardrobe. So consumerism does not actually bring lasting satisfaction, content, happiness, and so on. And I think if when you're all as old as I am, if all you had to look back on was I spent a lot of money, then you'd feel some sort of waste. Life would have passed you by. Aristotle thought that happiness was the exercise, in particular, of virtue. Well, never mind about the virtue bit, that sounds about high-minded. But I think happiness certainly arrives much more certainly in the exercise of capacities than it does in the exercise in achievements, than it does in, for example, buying something. Buying something is not an achievement. It simply signals that you've been given enough money, or you've been lucky enough to find enough money, or you've earned enough money. That might be an achievement, but then it's the achievement, not the money, that matters. So I think you're right that consumerism does lead to a sense of waste, a sense of nihilism, and psychologically I think that's true. The happiest people are the people who have managed to throw themselves into some worthwhile activity and to feel that they've achieved something thereby. I get my happiness, of course partly I get happiness from family, from children, from social relations, from friends, but very largely from feeling that I've done something quite well today. I go to bed contented if I feel I've done something better than I might have done it. That's good. does it have to be self-sacrifice? I mean, you mentioned the Christian ideal. The Christian ideal is the supreme self-sacrifice. I'm not sure it does. Self-sacrifice is really, it's a concept pretty foreign to classical thought. I don't think you find much about self-sacrifice in Aristotle. You don't find much about it. You certainly don't find much about it in the Cyrenaics, the Epicureans. They're not interested in self-sacrifice. They are interested, however, in achievement, in activity in accordance with virtue, which their idea of virtue wasn't, heroic self-sacrifice. It was doing things properly. It might in times of stress and battle include self-sacrifice, the self-sacrifice of the warrior who stands his ground, who doesn't run away. That kind of courage was a Greek ideal, a pagan ideal. But it wasn't particularly concerned with altruism, it was more concerned with loyalty and with the kind of exercise of courage, which means you're capable of standing up to difficulties, to overcoming difficulties. It could be a female virtue as well as a male warrior's virtue. I think that the great mistake here is to think that you can't achieve a life with meaning in it without a religious ideal of something beyond the life itself. That is a sort of transcendental option, that the only thing that would give life here meaning is, for example, an eternity of life, life after death, a life that lasts forever. People get very worried about the meaning in life when they think about the size of the universe or the length of time. The length of time there's going to be after you're dead. The length of time there's going to be after you're forgotten. The endless galaxies, hundreds of thousands, millions of galaxies in which you're not heard of. So we're very insignificant in the space of the universe, either in space or time. And then they think, oh, well, it would be better if we were bigger, if we lasted for longer, or if we occupied more space. And I think that's just a mistake. That's imagining a meaning arriving from mere lasting longer. But if lasting longer was just more of the same, it wouldn't give meaning at all. I mean, I find meaning in something like one of my children's smile, or meeting my wife after an absence. That's a meaningful experience. It wouldn't be more meaningful if it went on forever. In fact, it would be awful. You imagine your baby smiling at you forever, like that. I mean, that doesn't give meaning. That stops it being what a smile needs to be, which is an action with a finite time to it. So I think you have to learn to find meaning in perspective. In our perspective, people like you fill my perspective at present. I find meaning in trying to speak to you in ways that you appreciate or the ways that mean something to you. And if I fail in that, then this evening has no meaning for me. The fact that this evening won't go on forever, or it won't be heard on Mars, or it won't be heard in the next galaxy, that doesn't matter at all. I see the world in perspective from here, and you loom very large, and your reaction to my talk matters a great deal. That will give meaning to this evening. The rest of the universe can go go hang. I don't care about it. So I think nihilism is essentially a sort of immature feeling that nothing matters unless it matters to everyone, everywhere, all the time. And you have to learn not to think like that. Things matter because they matter to you and me here now. That's the succession. Life is a succession of things mattering to you and me and here and now. It's not a matter of things mattering to the universe.
Boa noite, professor. Nós estamos transmitindo.
Can you just wait a second? I put these on.
Boa noite, professor. Nós estamos transmitindo no site da CPFL Cultura onde mais de 500 internautas nos acompanham, e eles fizeram uma série de perguntas. A Tainá quer saber o que o senhor diria para os futuros filósofos, para os estudantes de filosofia. Qual ideia, reflexão ou conselho o senhor daria para essas pessoas?
What advice would I give? What advice would I give to new arrivals in the commonwealth of philosophy? New people, people new to philosophy, people coming into philosophy. That's a very general, very difficult question. Do what you enjoy. Enjoy it. Philosophy is, whatever else it is, philosophical writing is part of the world's literature. What advice would I give to people coming to literature? Find literature you enjoy and learn to enjoy it, and learn to enjoy it more. And that's the same with philosophy. I mean, there are philosophers I enjoy more than others. But eventually you can enjoy the difficult ones because you enjoy overcoming the difficulty. I've mentioned David Hume as possibly the most attractive philosophical writer, certainly in the Anglo-Saxon tradition. Beautiful writer, generous, warm-hearted, sensible, insightful person. He was known as Le Bon David, the good David in Paris in the time of the Enlightenment. So he's just a sheer pleasure to read Hume on most things. Some things he's very difficult. So that's an immediate point of enjoyment. You read Hume and then you learn that, for example, Immanuel Kant had issues with the way Hume saw things. So you start reading Immanuel Kant. Now, Kant is not nearly so immediately enjoyable. Kant taught philosophy to speak German. And people say Hegel taught philosophy to speak German, but Kant really taught. A lot of German speakers read Kant in the English translation by Norman Kemp Smith because the English is intelligible in a way that the German is not. Still, Kant is rewarding. Kant is eventually enjoyable because he's very, very acute and insightful. And his criticisms of Hume deserve taking very seriously. They're very important. So there's another sphere of enjoyment opens up. You enjoy the... it's like seeing, your favorite chess player, and then you realize there's an even better chess player, and you go up a rung, and so on. A very good writer of philosophy, for example, is Ludwig Wittgenstein, whom I've mentioned before. Wittgenstein's a wonderful stylist, and he's a wonderful stylist in German and in the English translation. It translates. But you read Wittgenstein, you can appreciate the language, but it's often very difficult to appreciate the form the argument is taking. It's sort of, he doesn't argue in a linear, direct way. He argues around a problem because he's trying to make you see it in a different light. He's trying to take the blinkers off. And that can be very difficult. It's difficult to see what he's doing very often. But again, when you learn to see that, you feel, oh, isn't that wonderful? If only I could have thought of that, and that's another enjoyment. So I think you follow the writers you find enjoyable. That's my advice to anyone starting philosophy. But don't be lazy with yourself. Don't think that, the sort of pretty and easy philosophy is the last word, because it never is. It'll be a bit like learning to appreciate music. Everyone starts off learning to appreciate, wallpaper Mozart. Very easy, the kind of thing that you hear in restaurants or lifts or something, elevators. But then you gradually hear Beethoven's late quartets, or you hear some Brahms, or you go on to the 20th century, and it becomes hard, and you have to listen more carefully. But if you don't have to lose your enjoyment. You don't have to say, oh, I used to like enjoyable music, but now I find I'm interested in Berg or Schoenberg or something. What you say is, I used to like pretty or interesting or undemanding music. Now I'm really fascinated by or interested in more difficult music. And it's the same with philosophy.
Good evening. I was in the industry for many years,
Oh, yes.
and as a manager and a leader, I thought the problem of finding a common solution, a cooperative solution, is one of the most important challenge of a manager and a leader, and at the same time most exciting challenge of a leader. And I have read many definitions of a leader, folks like Peter Drucker, and I don't happen to have heard any definition coming from a philosopher to a leader. So my question is, what is the importance of leadership and of a leader in the present days, helping folks, helping communities, helping countries to find cooperative solution and put it in action?
Right. Well, there are, as you rightly say, there are 1,000 books out there about leadership. Management gurus, airports have whole sections on management leadership and so on. I think many philosophers would I think it's quite sorry, let me think for a moment. The question is new to me, so I have to think. It's quite a good technique in philosophy to not to trust nouns. Nouns are very dangerous. People ask, what is liberty? What is freedom? What are numbers? What are values? What are, and then the noun follows. What is leadership? It's often a good practice to substitute concentration on the verb. What is it to lead people? Leadership is just a quality we say belongs to people who can lead people. Well, of course, you can lead people into temptation. The devil tried to lead Christ into temptation, and he might have succeeded, except, of course, he wasn't going to. You can lead people into bad pathways. You can lead people into this, that, or the other. People with the ability to lead other people are basically people with the ability to persuade other people of something or other, to do something or to think a certain way or to follow a certain course of action. If in business you have the capacity to lead people into good courses of action, efficient courses of action, cooperative solutions, into feeling themselves part of a team, part of a unity, then of course you will be very successful. You will have done something which a good business leader needs to do. I'm not sure that there are any recipes for that. It's very contextual, of course. Partly there'll be some particular set of obstacles that you have to lead people across. Moses had to lead people into the promised land. I think the difficulties included no water, no certainty of where they were going, and so on. There's an old Jewish joke that, of course, what he managed to do was to lead them into the only part of the Middle East that has no oil, which is perhaps not true or not, I don't know. So you can lead people, you can persuade them, you can get them to follow you in a course of action. I don't think, as I say, I don't think there's a recipe for doing that. There may be some generalizations, but they will be very vague. You have to get them to want to do it. You have to get them to want to follow you. But how you do that in a particular circumstance may be very contextual. There may be no recipe, no certainty. there may be 5 people in this audience that I could lead to doing a university course in philosophy. There may be 50, 100 people I couldn't lead to doing that because it would depend on what the obstacles are, why they don't want to do it, what I've managed to say that somehow hooks on to something in their motivational state. It might also depend on what they're afraid of, what other opportunities they have, all sorts of things. So I suppose if there's a single common denominator about good leaders, it would be an ability to understand and work against the obstacles that prevent people wanting to follow you in whatever course of action you're proposing. So I see that as a constant human problem. Many of us would like other people to follow us in courses of action which we would like them to follow. And there are no doubt tricks of flattery. The politician flatters his audience. There are tricks of working on their fears, that if you don't follow me, things will go very badly. There are tricks of finding common enemy, so that we must all band together because otherwise the Chinese will beat us. There are many motivational hooks. People are creatures of greed, of fear, of competitiveness, of status. We have all these motivational footholds, and the good leader has to learn to use those to persuade people to follow him. But I don't think there's any one recipe because people are so different and they have different fears, different hopes, different sources of amour propre or pride, and which one will work at a particular time. It will require a lot of human intelligence, emotional intelligence, to find what works for a particular group at a particular time. On top of that, that's true when you think of individual trying to lead another individual. When you think of an individual trying to lead a group of people, I think group dynamics are very difficult to understand. All of us who teach, the beginning of every year, I go into a class. I can be teaching the same topic that I've taught perhaps 20 times, the same age group, same kind of students, different year. The dynamic of a class can be entirely different from one year to the next. Sometimes they're on my side. It's easy. I feel it's going well, they feel it's going well, they're enjoying the class. It's magic. It's easy for me. And they do well. Sometimes they're sullen, they sit there, the atmosphere is not good. There was perhaps 1 or 2 troublemakers who somehow spread an atmosphere of mistrust or skepticism, and the class doesn't work. Now, I have no recipe for making a class that doesn't work into one that does work, although I will try to excite various motivations. I might try and make them afraid. You're going to do badly, you're going to get C. Or I might just try to persuade them that they're going to have a much better time if they start to cooperate. It's very difficult. I might make them afraid or ashamed. Last year they were much better than you are. So you see what works. Trial and error.
Vamos passar para a última pergunta da noite. Yes. Vamos passar para a última pergunta da noite. Pedimos desculpa para quem não conseguiu ser atendido. Obrigado.
Ok. Parabéns por sua palestra. Eu conheço o senhor como homem que tenta, a cada dia, tirar a filosofia das torres de marfim, né, e levá-las, digamos, numa linguagem brasileira, às favelas. Nós temos hoje 3 desafios quando nós falamos em filosofia, ou 3 visões. Há aqueles que acham que filosofia é a arte de pensar o pensamento pensado. Então, as faculdades ensinam ele a sair de lá e dizer assim, como dizia Nietzsche, como dizia Spinoza, como dizia Immanuel Kant, como dizia Aristóteles, Platão, e jamais, como digo eu, como dizia eu mesmo. nós temos uma outra vertente aqui nesse país, que é a praticidade da filosofia. Quando se quer desqualificar o pensamento de alguém, disse, seja prático, pare de filosofar. E nós temos aqueles que sabem, que são os conscientizados, que filosofia é o amigo da filosofia, o amigo da vida, do saber e etc. A pergunta que eu faço para o senhor é, quais são os desafios de popularizar a filosofia baseada nessas três visões diferentes?
That's a very good question. Let me criticize one word in the question. It was also a word which was used introducing me. I don't like to think of myself as somebody who popularizes philosophy. I think of myself as somebody who brings people to philosophy. I don't bring philosophy to people. It's quite easy to provide what I think of as chicken soup for the soul. Sort of easy, simple, kind of the kind of writing you get in management studies. It's a sort of common sense with a little bit of jargon. That is not what I want. I want people to appreciate the power of ideas, the difficulty of ideas, the reason why taking command of ideas is so important and is better than having ideas take control of you. So that's just a word about popularize. Of course, there are going to be skeptics. There are going to be people who say, reflection, I don't need that stuff. And it's certainly true. For large parts of life, we don't need that stuff. You want to know the bus timetable, you don't ask a philosopher. You ask the bus timetable. You go to Google, you search it, and so on. What I'm interested in are the categories that structure our thoughts, the categories that structure our terms of cooperation, our politics, and our ethics. If people say that that's not practical, I would take... I think that is itself a kind of blindness. We conceptualize the world, we think of the world in terms of concepts. Just take a concept like progress. You can immediately start to interrogate that and wonder what the costs and burdens of progress are. Think of a concept like reason. We all like to think that we're reasonable. The philosopher's supposed to be, above all, a guardian of reason. Somebody like Hume comes along and asks us to interrogate the concept of reason. What makes for reason in human affairs? Experience. We all like to think that we learn from experience, but what's experience? Experience comes filtered. It's filtered especially by memory. How do we know when we're using experience in the right way and in the wrong way to come to ideas about things? You don't have to ask those questions, and some people have no interest in those questions. My own father was an engineer, and he could never understand what I did. I tried to explain to him. I think the only philosophical problem he ever found interesting was, how do I know that I see colors in the same way that you do? He could see that as a problem. He had a sort of grasp of the problem of other minds, problem of consciousness. Now, I think that problem can be solved, actually, but he thought it was insoluble and puzzling. But then he thought it was just a puzzle. You just put it aside and got on with the business of doing engineering, in his case. To me, a puzzle is there to be solved, so I do require a certain kind of ambition from a young philosopher. I think actually far more, the great economist Keynes said, John Maynard Keynes, said that practical men of business who think that they are immune to ideas are nearly always the slaves of some defunct economist. That is some theory, some view. And I think that, the theory I started off talking about, the theory that greed is good, the change in the climate of ideas that led to the egoism and the worship of the market of the last 20 years. That was a change in ideas. Someone like Mrs. Thatcher probably didn't see herself as an ideologue, as somebody in the grip of a set of ideas. But she certainly was. She was in the grip of a set of ideas, and in some respects, a very weak set of ideas. So I think that, ideas gone wrong. Hitler was in the grip of a set of ideas. He had the ideas of nationhood. He had the ideas of race, which have no biological foundation. He had ideas of economics, which had very little economic foundation. He was a victim of certain kinds of paranoia, which is a set of ideas about other people or some bad elements in society doing down the others. The whole Nazi ideology was just a mishmash of ideas, and some of those ideas had roots in German Romanticism. Some of them had roots in, I'm afraid, Christianity, actually. The anti-Semitic elements. So, you can never be sure where a bad set of ideas might lead. If not you, at any rate somebody else. So it's worth trying to get them right. Thank you.
Thank you. Muito obrigado, Sr. BlackBurn, por essa, esclarecimento sobre a filosofia como potente instrumento de reflexão, que nos permite refletir numa sociedade, sempre dual, entre a cooperação e a competição. Lembrando que nessa sexta-feira, que às 19 horas, no Café Filosófico, daremos continuidade ao módulo Família, com o tema Adolescentes, ontem, hoje e amanhã, apresentado pelo Dr. Ivan Capelato. E neste sábado, não percam a música erudita com a dupla de trompetista e percussionista de marimba, em tempo de duo, como sempre, às 20 horas. Agradecemos a presença de todos vocês. Gostaria de encerrar com um aplauso de agradecimento ao nosso convidado. Obrigado.
Thank you. Thank you.